The Mayberry Investments Limited Virtual Investor Forum has been the standard for investor education in Jamaica for decades, where top financial minds provide comprehensive insight into the market and ideal investment strategies and opportunities for our clients. Celebrating 37 years of excellence in investment banking. The Mayberry Virtual Investor Forum, investing in Jamaica.
Well, good evening and again, everybody. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Honorable Nigel, Clarke, Minister of Finance and Public Service, Chairman Berry. Good evening to you all, to our special guests. We really appreciate you at our very first Investor Forum of the year. I'm your host, Dan Theok, Senior Vice President of Investment Banking here at Mayberry Investments. As usual, we are joined for what feels like the 5th edition of our very first Forum of the year, where we're joined by our special guest, the Honorable Nigel Clarke, Minister of Finance and Public Service, where we'll be reviewing the performance of the Jamaican economy over the last year. Also joining us on the panel, to my far left, is our Executive Chairman, Mr. Christopher Berry, and online we should also be joined by our CEO, Gary Parrott. So once again, welcome.
Good night. Good night, Dr. Nigel.
To our attendees online, please stick around to the end of the program because, as usual, we'll be addressing Q&As for your benefit, and we'll also encourage viewers online to subscribe to our Mayberry channel so that you can get programs like this just about every week. And if you're looking to embark on your very first investment journey with Mayberry, please take that first step with us. You can follow us on social media online to get more details. Now I'd like to introduce our guest of honor, Dr. Honorable Nigel Clarke, who, as everyone knows, is the Minister of Finance and Public Service and a Member of Parliament for St. Andrew Northwestern. Prior to his appointment as Minister of Finance, Minister Clarke served as Ambassador at Large for Economic Affairs, Chairman of Port Authority, Chairman of the National Housing Trust, just to name a few. Mr. Clarke is a financier and businessman by background, and he spent over 2 decades in the private sector. He holds a doctorate of mathematics and an MSc in applied statistics, both from the Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar as well as a Commonwealth Scholar. And he also has a first degree in computer science from the University of West Indies, where he was a Jamaica Scholar. And today, Minister Clarke will be sharing a review of the Jamaican economy. Welcome, Minister Clarke, for what feels like the 5th edition. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And welcome, Chairman Berry. Thank you also for being with us in this special forum today.
Good evening, everyone.
Good deal. So, Minister Clarke, we have several questions for you, but as usual, I would like to allow you a few minutes to just describe your performance in the last year, or the performance of the Jamaican economy, and from that we'll just naturally flow into some nice questions. So, what have you done for us lately, sir, in the last year that you'd like to share?
Well, just good evening, everyone, and it's good to be here at another Mayberry Investors Forum. Mayberry has, Mayberry's brand is strong, but even stronger is the Mayberry Investor Forum, which usually kickstarts the year, the first, I believe, the first sort of public forum on investment and on the economy. So thank you for having me, and good evening to all of your guests who are watching online and those who are present here today. The Jamaican economy has performed creditably, I would say, over the past 12 months, or since we last met at the last Investor Forum. We have had 10 consecutive quarters of economic growth, and that is significant for a couple of reasons. It's significant given our historical background, where 10 consecutive quarters of economic growth is the second longest stretch of unbroken consecutive economic growth that we've had since we started measuring growth quarterly in 1997. The longest stretch was 20 quarters of, well, the 20th was flat, it was 0, so it was 19 quarters of growth and then a flat quarter. So 20 quarters of non-negative, if you want to put it that way, right? Just to be precise. That was the longest period, and that went from first quarter of 2015 all the way to the fourth quarter of 2019. So this is the second longest period. Before the current era, let us, if we can use that term, Jamaica's economy would grow for a few quarters and then decline. The longest would have been 9 quarters. But other than that 9 quarters, you had 2 quarters of growth, then decline. 4 quarters of growth, then decline. That's not an environment that fosters confidence and that is conducive to long-term investments, as we experience, right? This current era is quite different from the point of view of the plans that people are making, the investments that people are planning. So 10 quarters of economic growth is something that we're quite proud of, and we hope that, and we expect that the quarterly growth will continue for some time. In addition to that, over the last 12 months since we last met, we got confirmation of the fact that Jamaica ran its first current account surplus in over 30 years. So we tend to focus on the fiscal a lot because the fiscal is something that we can understand. We can have a metaphor of our own personal wallet, so to speak. But the balance of payments part of the economy is a critical gauge of stability. Now, just roughly speaking, our current account surplus is comprised of the balance on trade of goods and the balance of trade in services. On services, we kind of kill it, so to speak, because of the performance of tourism, and on goods, we tend to have a trade deficit. But the important statistic overall is what is happening as a sum of these, including our remittances, to give us our current account balance. So for the first time in 30 years, a positive current account balance. Now, current account deficits in themselves are not a bad thing. It all depends on what those deficits are financing. If we go through a period of having current account deficits and it is because of massive importation of capital goods, because there's a lot of investment taking place, a lot of building and so on, then that's a good thing. So by celebrating the surplus, it doesn't mean necessarily that current account deficits are bad. It just depends on what they are financing. If current account deficits are essentially financing consumption, that's not necessarily something that augurs, well for the future. But balance of payments performed extremely well, and the current account performance is evident in the performance of our net international reserves, which, as at the end of November, stood at about $4.6 billion US dollars, and that is essentially in the region of the highest levels that we've had then, 4.7, 4.8.
Over 20% improvement over the previous year.
Exactly. Thank you for that, Dan. Significant growth over the previous year. But if you compare it with 2016, I want to spend a little time on this. In February of 2016, our reserves were $2.7 billion. But there were $2.7 billion. And of that $2.7 billion, about 900 million, just over 924 million, was essentially financed by Bank of Jamaica certificates of deposit, where Jamaicans, investors or institutions could have a certificate of deposit at the central bank. The money really belongs to you, but it's in the central bank's possession, and so it forms part of our reserve stock. So the 2.7 billion had 924 million of CDs. So the quality of the 2.7 billion, if you want to use that phrase, would have been, less with the 924 million of CDs, meaning money the bank owed to the owners of those CDs. Today, let's put it this way, the CDs were 34% of the NIR stock in February 2016. Today, And one of the policy objectives of the past several years has been to wind down, I don't want to say get rid of, that sounds, but to dramatically reduce our reliance on certificates of deposits for our reserve numbers. Today, the central bank has been able to unwind those certificates of deposits, and I think a small amount exists of about 80 million or thereabouts. So the 4.7 billion is of a completely different quality to the in November of 2023 as compared to the 2.7 of February 2016. In February 2016, certificates of deposits represented 34% of our reserves. Today, it's 0.7% of reserves. So that is what it's Bank of Jamaica's resources, and that is a very good thing. The performance of the economy as far as our debt objectives, I think that's in the public domain. Jamaica is one of the few countries in the hemisphere where our debt is lower today than prior to COVID, and we are on track to meet those debt objective targets. As far as the pipeline of investments are concerned, and that is something that I know Minister Hill has spoken about on a number of occasions, and Minister Bartlett, we have a very robust pipeline in a number of sectors and a number of areas. Unemployment, we all know, is at record lows, and for the first time in my lifetime, and I think we could dare say in Chris's lifetime, which are very different numbers. Serious thing. Yeah. That immigration is a topic of discussion, a topic on which different segments of society have different points of view, but the fact that it's a topic of discussion is a measure of how far we have come in our employment statistics and data. I don't know if there's anything else you want me to touch on, but just going over those variables. Inflation, the central bank has had some success with inflation, which came in the 6 range in September and within the target in both September and October. And November, a little deviation as expected because of the effects of the government's decision to, support an increase in fares of in taxi fares. But the independence of the central bank to steer the implementation of monetary policy to achieve a low and stable inflation rate over the medium term is achieving its objective, and that is a good thing.
This is one of your favorite topics. Could you just talk a little bit about that? There are 3 pillars to economic resilience, and we'd like to hear how you feel like you guys are doing in that regard.
So macro, economic stability really rests on 4 important pillars. The first is fiscal sustainability and debt sustainability, the fact that your fiscal operations are sustainable and you won't have sort of jerks along the way, and your debt is manageable. That's the first pillar of stability. The second pillar of stability, and this is no order of importance, is that you have sufficient reserves in your central bank. Because without sufficient reserves, the world can't have confidence that you can pay your external bills as they come due. And indeed, Jamaica's perennial problem over several decades has been insufficient reserves in our central bank. The third is price stability. If prices are running away at double-digit rates, it's hardly an environment that is conducive for investment. It is the enemy of those on fixed incomes and so forth. And the fourth pillar is financial sector stability. Now, if you look at the Jamaican economy over the period, certainly from the early 1970s to the present time, what you sort of easily see in that most of the decades between then and now, a majority of these four, and sometimes all four, have been missing. You think of the certainly the latter part of the last 5 years of the 1970s, Jamaica suffered from declining and insufficient reserves in our central bank, escalating debt and fiscal sustainability problems. Price stability was absent, so 3 of the 4. In the 1980s, obviously started with low reserves. That didn't, and reserves were still inadequate at the end of the period. Debt would have been high at the end of the period. And though we made marked progress, especially as far as economic growth was concerned, in the last 4 years of the 1980s, prices still moved at a high clip, double-digit inflation. You come to so 3 of the 4. You come to the 1990s, insufficient reserves, high debt, price instability, and financial sector instability. All 4 elements of macro instability were present in the 1990s. Going into the 2000s, insufficient reserves in our central bank, by international standards and benchmarks, high debt, and price instability as measured by the rate of inflation. Not uniformly through the decade, but for much of the decade. The era that we enjoy today is one that is characterized by debt sustainability, reserve adequacy, meaning sufficient reserves in our central bank. We have price stability, single-digit inflation. Global factors have influenced that, but with an independent central bank and the institutional mechanisms that are geared and have the backed by legislation to implement monetary policy to ensure that low and stable inflation is achieved, and touch wood, financial sector stability. So, I would put forward that this current era, wherever you want to measure its, whatever you want to measure, where these 4, you could say that we had these 4. It's what distinguishes the current era from the past. And it's an achievement of the entire society, and one that we must work assiduously hard to protect. And we must be jealous of anything that can damage that stability as measured by those 4 planks. Because we have learned from our experience that when you lose stability, it's very, very hard for it to return. And we lost macroeconomic stability for nearly 5 decades. Yeah. So, economic resilience is built on a foundation of stability. And in each of these areas, certainly in the first 2, it is having those metrics at levels that give you policy flexibility. So if your debt is low enough, you have the policy flexibility to respond to crises should they emerge. And as a result, crises don't last as long. We went into the pandemic with our debt ratio at 94%, which for us, given our historical record, was low. For everybody else, that's extraordinarily high, but low relative to our past. And that was useful, helpful. Imagine the flexibility that we have when we get to 60%. Similarly, having sufficient reserves in your central bank allows you to have buffers for economic shocks that can disrupt the supply of foreign exchange. It doesn't mean that if there's a disruption in supply, it won't hurt people or we won't feel the effects. Yes, we will. But with a high level of reserves, the possibility of ensuring that that balance of payment shock does not precipitate other crises is more assured when reserves are at a high level. So we have focused in a decided way with intentionality on building economic resilience. And that for me is particularly important because we're a small country. Our economy is focused on a few sectors that generate sufficient foreign exchange. So if you think about it, there are sort of 3 or 4 sectors that generate more than 200 million US dollars each, right? So we have a economic base that's narrow. We're small in size, and trade is 80% of GDP. That makes us open, and it makes us vulnerable. And we must take responsibility that our policy for our vulnerability, and our economic policy has to take into consideration our circumstances and the appropriate policy for circumstances of structural vulnerability. We can't get away from the small size when it will take some time to fundamentally change the structure of the economy. We're not going to get away from our climatic zone. So we have structural vulnerability, and the appropriate policy response over time and indefinitely is to make sure that we're economically resilient, that we have flexibility, because we will not be able to get away from economic shocks. That has been our history, and it will continue to be our experience. The difference must be that the economy is resilient enough and has and which allows for the flexibility to respond in targeted and temporary ways when we face economic shocks.
I concur in terms of economic resilience. We've seen over the last 4 decades, we're always going to have shocks to the economy. And I think the difference with the pandemic, which is the largest shock the economy has felt in 4 decades, is in the late 70s, you spend 14 years recovering in terms of economic output. In the late 80s, you spent 11 years recovering, and now we've spent 2.5 years to get back to pre-pandemic levels in terms of the 3 variables we mentioned: economic output, unemployment, and debt to GDP. So that is
correct.
That's excellent.
No, thank you for raising that, Dan. And I think that those are experiences that, as Jamaicans and as Jamaican investors and Jamaican citizens, we need to internalize. Our history is rich in lessons, and as Dan mentioned, as a result of the economic shock of the 1970s and the social dislocation, we had economic declines in 1975 and 1976, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, 79 and 80. And in 75, the decline was about 6.5%, and it was about 4.2% the year after. It took until 1989 for us to recover in real terms, to have output that surpassed 1975. 14 years to get back to the 1975 level. In the global financial crisis, which is more recent and everybody can probably recall, the economy declined by 3.2% in 2008 or thereabouts. It declined in 2009, declined in 2010. It took until 2019 for economic output to surpass 2008 in real terms, 11 years. The COVID pandemic, the economic shock was 10%. So compare that with a 3.2 in the global financial crisis, 6.5 in 1976. Yet, we were able to recover lost output by, in terms of quarters, quarter 2022 was bigger than quarter 19, i.e. we attained pre-COVID levels of output on a quarterly basis by December 2022. In terms of full year, the full year of 2023 is likely, given the first 3 quarters, to be higher in real terms than the full year of 2019. Again, shortened economic recovery period. Certainly jobs recovered. It took us We lost 150,000 jobs over 4 years as a result of the global financial crisis, right? Between the job losses were just steady over 4 years, 150,000 jobs. And it took, I believe, another 5 or 6 years to get those jobs back. So putting the entire period together from the beginning, right? Sort of 8 years to get back to where we started at the high as far as jobs are concerned. And that is a rough number. This time around, instead of losing 150,000 jobs in 4 years, we lost approximately 150,000 jobs in 4 months. And we were able to get not necessarily the same jobs, but we were able to recover lost jobs within a very short period of time. And in fact, the job number, the number of people employed today is larger than the number of people employed prior to COVID. It's more than 1.3 million persons were employed, the largest number in our history. And let me just talk about the unemployment number for a while. You know, for 25 years between 1990 and 2015, unemployment averaged, if you take the unemployment rate every quarter over that 25-year period, it averaged about 14%. Between 1990 and 2015, 14%. Over the past 7 years, we have had single-digit unemployment for every quarter except for, I believe it was 2 quarters during COVID. And not only single-digit unemployment over every quarter apart from 2 quarters during COVID, but pre-COVID we had a record going down to 7%, and post-COVID a record going down to, 4.5%. A completely different paradigm. The benefits of resilience are obvious. The benefits of macroeconomic stability are abundantly clear. And as I said before, as a society, we have to rally together to ensure that we allow nothing to take away what we as a society have worked so hard for and whose benefits are abundantly clear for all to see.
Thank you for that, Minister. So I have 4 or 5 questions coming up, and we're going to try to connect it a little bit back eventually to investor confidence in the capital markets, because that's what we're really about. But before we get there, I have 3 or 4 more questions just on the macro level. And so the first one for me, Minister, is how important it is to increase productivity. And I want to appreciate what you're going to be doing about that in terms of increasing productivity for our Jamaica labor force if we really want to grow our GDP.
Productivity is where it's at now. The Prime Minister has been speaking about productivity, and that's a central theme for us as a government. Productivity in the public sector and productivity in the private sector. What economic growth is inextricably linked with productivity. In fact, productivity gains explain a lot of economic growth. And what's productivity at the base level? It is being able to produce more output with the same level of input, and output measured in volume and in time, or it's able to produce more output with less input. Either way you want to measure it. Now, at a level of the economy, public investment can be geared in such a way that it improves productivity. So the first question I want, first leg of the answer, is to say that we are going to be intentionally focused on public investments that are productivity enhancing. And let me give you an example. Public transportation. People have to get to work. The more time people spend getting to work is the less productive time that exists. And if you can take at the level of a society, and let's just do a thought experiment, 1.3 million people, and let us say 1.3 million people between going to work and coming back from work, spend I'm just doing a thought experiment. Let's say going to work and coming back from work, the average amount of time across all 1.3 million people is 90 minutes. Okay, that's 1 point, or let's just a thought experiment and say 2 hours, because it's easy example. For some people it's more, but 2 hours going to work and coming back from work. And let's put in the middle for those who actually drive and have to pick up children and so on. So let's say 2 hours commute. That's a pretty reasonable actually. 2 hours commuting during the day that's not a part of your productive day. Multiply that by 1.3 million people. 2 hours times 1.3 million people is 2.6 million hours. 2.6 million hours divided by 24 is 100,000 approximately. Correct?
Yep, roughly.
That's approximately. That's 100,000 days. 100,000 days divided by 365 is, anybody want to answer? Come on, you work with me. Huh? No, 100,000 days. 100,000 divided by 365 days per year. Huh? Okay, that's 30. That's a lifetime. So if we can cut that average, and I'm just using it 2 hours, the average may not be 2, but use it 2. If from public investment we can cut that 2 by half an hour or by 45 minutes, the gains to the society would be immense in terms of recovery of lost time. And that is what we mean by productivity enhancing investment. What are the investments that are required for that? The investments that are required are investments in our road infrastructure, in making sure that we can get around the country efficiently, safely, and in good time. We can get to work and from work in good time. And clearly we have a lot of work to do there in terms of, so investment in roads and in road infrastructure, which is why the government this year will, well, at my last budget presentation, I announced that we'll be doing a Spark program of road investment of $40 billion over 2 years. And that's on top of any highway investments that we pursue. So investment in road infrastructure can be productivity enhancing and is productivity enhancing. Investment in public transportation. The 2 hours average is reasonable because there's wait time for the bus and there's time on the bus. If we can have sufficient buses that are available, that reduces wait time, and then make other changes, the productivity gains can be significant. And I spent a lot of time on this example, but there are other public investments that can similarly return lost hours. And by returning lost hours, we enhance our productivity. Now, the other element of productivity gains for society is to improve the functional capacity of the workforce, of the existing workforce and of the future workforce. Productivity is enhanced by well-placed and thoughtful human capital investment. And that's where we are focused in terms of the Education Reform Commission, making investments in education to ensure that each person who leaves school is more productive than the same person 30 years before. That's not immediate, but that's the direction. And then, obviously, productivity is enhanced by investments in health. And the government is in, because, you know, if you are out of work for each day that you're out of work, it reduces the productivity of that organization. And if you think about the prevalence of non-communicable diseases, the absence of primary care or state of hospitals, investments in hospitals and health infrastructure are productivity enhancing. The government is engaged in building out the hospital infrastructure of the country. Just yesterday, the Prime Minister and the Minister of Health broke ground on the Spanish Town Hospital, and that is going to be built at the same time as the Western Children's Hospital and the Cornwall Regional Rehabilitation. And there are over 10 clinics that the Health Ministry is going to be focused on, in addition to other hospital groundbreakings to come. So we are planning to take a multifaceted approach towards, at a society level, at the level of the economy, productivity enhancing reforms, which affect both public and private sector. With respect to the public sector, the productivity enhancing reforms will include digitization, and the Prime Minister has appointed a minister with responsibility for that area, because the gains are potentially tremendous. Of being able to, if you think about what we did in the pandemic, we're faced with a problem that we never had before, where we needed to distribute resources to the population. They couldn't come in into offices and do normal paperwork. We had to put a digital solution in place. And if you can, it seems like a long time ago now, but within weeks, we were able, of course, we had some teething pains on the back end, but we were able to get resources to nearly 400,000 persons. Doing it the traditional way, that's productivity. Doing it the traditional way to get benefits to 400,000 people who had to, just imagine, let's do a thought experiment. There are 30,000 people who fill a stadium. So just imagine, what's that? 14 stadium approximately, or 13 stadia of people. Each of them having to go and fill out a form, somebody having to check the form, and then get the money from the Ministry of Finance, and then send it. Just imagine how long that would take. It would take, it would take a year and a half. We're able to get it done in a matter of weeks. I would say 75% of it went out within 4 or 5 weeks, and some of the 25% might have taken a little longer. That's an example of how digitization can enhance productivity. Something that, just by way of a guesstimate, sitting on a chair, nothing scientific, but something that would probably have taken 18 months, we're able to get done in 6 weeks because of digitization. So the digitization agenda is extremely important and done in a way that doesn't leave anybody behind. Also, in the public sector, reforming our processes to ensure that we can get more done in the same amount of time. Some of our processes were implemented a long time ago or designed a long time ago when we worked in different ways, different kinds of functionality, and are some easy, quick wins that we intend to. So I took a lot of time on that, but enhancing the productivity of the economy is very, very important to us, and something that we plan to spend a lot of energy and time on.
Good deal. Last one for me on the macro level, and then after that, Chairman Barry, I'll invite you to ask a question, and I promise, guys, we're going to make it real relative to the capital markets. The last one for me at the macro level, Nigel, is the idea that we have this debt to GDP target of 60%. Just want to understand how that's going, and then the importance of it, what it means to the economy. Also, in addition to the debt to GDP, the idea of managing our interest costs as a percentage of GDP. If you could just speak to those things and help us to appreciate the focus, the fiscal rules, the discipline, and what it means for the economy.
Thank you for that, Dan. So our fiscal rules prescribe a debt target, and by debt target, the debt ratio, debt to GDP target, that has to be achieved by March of 2028, which is just around the corner, just 4 years from now. And that target is 60%. The fiscal rules further say that because we have agreed to achieve that target, then each year we calculate the fiscal balance that is consistent with achieving that target. And that fiscal balance is prescribed by the fiscal rules, how you calculate it. And so each year, the budget is cast within an envelope that result in that fiscal balance being targeted and achieved. And Jamaica has, for the past 7 years of this government, achieved fiscal target on each occasion. And for the previous 3 years of the previous government, achieved the fiscal target on each occasion.
It means running a surplus.
No, it doesn't mean running a surplus. No. The fiscal target can be, in some years it has been a deficit, right? Okay. It depends on the prevailing circumstances. We have had a balanced budget for the past few years because that is what is consistent with the fiscal rule.
So running a primary surplus.
No, a primary surplus. You remember the surplus before interest.
Yep.
The fiscal balance is the balance after interest.
I understand.
No, not for you. I know you understand, but just for everybody. So we, in this budget, we expect that by the end of March, we will be at about 74% or lower, right? It's likely to be, it could be likely to be lower, but about that, which is, coming from 110% just after the pandemic. And we are on track to hitting the 60, but you rightly, your question rightly speaks to that the debt target is really a proxy for an even more important variable, but a variable that is not as
publicized
to talk about, right? It's easy to talk about the debt and the debt level, but it's a proxy for a more important variable, which is your interest cost as a proportion of GDP. Because it is that determines how much space that you really have, right? Jamaica has never defaulted on its debt, and our constitution provides some assurance of that. And so interest has to be paid. The higher the debt that you have, the more interest you'll have to pay, and the more that interest is a percentage of GDP. There was a time not so long ago when Jamaica's interest cost as a percentage of GDP was 16%. And to put it in context, our revenues, or let us say our tax revenues, because we have other revenues, but our tax revenues, I'm just giving rough numbers here just to make a point, in the region of 26, 27% of GDP, let us say, 25, 26, 27. So when you have to take 16 points out just for interest, it is calamitous. Yeah? That interest cost has gone down substantially over many, many, many years to about 5 points of GDP. Now, when we were at 16 points of GDP, we were running nasty deficits. So it's not a matter that that reduction is all right. That reduction has meant that those deficits, have been brought in. But even 5% of GDP is still high. In my budget presentation in March, I spoke to the fact that, your interest cost as a proportion of GDP is dependent on two things. It's dependent on your average interest rate, and it is dependent on your debt stock. And Jamaica's average interest rate is a reflection of where we have borrowed over a number of years. And you'll know very well that at times in the past, we borrowed at 12% in US dollars and 13% in US dollars and so forth. So our average sort of interest cost, even when you put in the lower cost loan, is between sort of 5 and 6% or thereabouts. Now you compare that with other countries like the United States. The last time I checked, even though their debt ratio is a lot higher than ours, because historically they have borrowed at very low rates, their interest costs as a percentage of GDP is very low and much lower than ours. The last time I checked, so this is not a number as at January 2023, but it's a number at some time, not January 2024, it's a number at some time in 2023, their interest cost as a percentage of GDP was in the range of 2% or thereabouts. It will certainly change with the higher interest rates and the higher cost of debt and the higher debt levels that they have. So I say that in response to your question, that now that we are kind of getting the absolute level of debt under control, or the debt to GDP ratio under control, we have to turn our attention to the composition of that debt and to managing, our interest exposure. There's so much you can do. The interest rate environment is not one that the government determines necessarily. Meaning global factors are very important as far as that is concerned. Now, so on the composition of our debt, Jamaica has traditionally had our foreign debt representing a larger share of debt than the local. And the reason for that is that, going to borrow, capital markets overseas are much broader, bigger, and deeper than capital markets in Jamaica. So if you want to access large amounts of capital, historically, Jamaica has done that by borrowing externally. So today, foreign debt is about 60% of our total debt stock. It could be about 62 or thereabouts, some 60 to 62 or thereabouts. In terms of resilience, as we described earlier, what we want to do over time is to reverse the currency composition in favor of local debt or locally denominated debt. Jamaica is more secure, more resilient if what we owe is we owe people in the currency that is ours. When Germany goes to borrow, part of Germany's strength is that they can borrow in their own currency, euro, for the most part. A part of Japan's economic strength is that when it goes to borrow, it can borrow in its own currency. And if you look at their currency composition, it's vastly denominated in the currency that is theirs, that they print. Small developing countries have not been so fortunate because of the dynamics that I mentioned earlier. However, because of the entrenched stability that we as a country have achieved, because of the discipline that we have shown, because of the institutionalization of reforms, including the independence of the central bank, Jamaica in November was able to raise for the very first time, or to place for the very first time, a Jamaican dollar linked bond in international capital markets. Something that would have been unthinkable only 3 or 4 years ago. Well, 3 years ago, the pandemic, it would have been utterly unthinkable only 3 years ago. The major achievement for our country. And it paves the way for us to begin to seriously put in place a plan to change the currency composition of our debt. Clearly, it's easier to change the currency composition if your debt stock is increasing, right? Because all you do is renew debt, you just borrow in Jamaican dollars. Changing the currency composition when your debt stock is declining is challenging. But that is the policy objective that over time we want. And just like with the nominal value of our debt, it was 147, and 140, 135. It takes time and it comes in, but you keep at it, you get there. We're at 62 now, and the idea is to get to 61, get to 60, get to 59, get to 58, slowly over time, changing the currency composition of the debt, because that makes us much more secure.
Thank you, Minister. Chairman Berry, I'm going to turn over you to let you ask your first question of the night.
Okay. So, Minister, you are in the catbird seat. You have the full picture. All these people here, they're all investors. So what they want to know is what sectors should they be putting their capital in right now?
All right, so what I say to you on that, Chris, is that my job is to pursue policy that creates an environment that's conducive to investment. Your job is to find the sectors. Right.
No.
So I,
So you're not going to tell them anything.
I'm not into picking sectors. I can tell you.
I need to ask you to pick a sector, Minister. So, like, if you say you want to, you want growth, all of this.
Right.
You're the people there with the money. So,
Right.
if you could say to them, hey, pick some sectors that the country would benefit, they would benefit. What would those be?
You think that they sat around the table with Clinton and Bush and Trump and Biden and said, hey, no, they started Google, they started Amazon, and they took advantage of our environment. We are creating.
I like that, you're comparing us to the US.
Absolutely.
I like that. That's huge. That's about 20 trillion.
Creating the most favorable environment for investment that has existed in Jamaica for a very long time. In living memory, I dare say. Every year over the past few years, more companies are formed than ever before. As at the last time I checked, I think it was for 2022, there were 5,400 new companies that were formed, which was 11% higher than the year before. And that year would have been higher than, I believe, the year before that. The environment for investment is fertile, and our job is to do our best and to pursue policy that maintains that fertility. Now, in terms of projects that the government is working on that might lead to investment opportunities, I can speak about that. But investment opportunities ought not to be limited to those. We, certainly among, we are seeing a certain dynamism, particularly among young people, a number of young people starting companies and taking advantage of the innovation grants and the other, well, I want to talk about it in a second, you give me an opportunity. So in terms of what some of the things that the government is doing that will create direct investment, I can speak about that. We, plan that the companies that we announced earlier that we would take public, we are committed to that. And I know in previous budgets, we announced Jamaica Mortgage Bank, and we announced, certain infrastructure assets. We are still planning on taking those public, and I'll say more about that at a later date. We are pursuing public-private partnerships that will lead to investment opportunities. Again, in a previous budget, we'd have announced that we're going to seek to make a major public investment in a North Coast road, not the highway, but the North Coast road from Montreal to Montego Bay, which is likely to be the largest infrastructure investment up to now, the largest single infrastructure investment in Jamaica. And that's an investment that we hope to partner with the private sector on by inviting persons to bid, and there'll be more said about that later. The government is, and I know that I'm just advertising here, UDC just launched a bid for some lands in Caymanas for persons to put in expressions of interest for development. This is lands that are contiguous to Kingston and could be site of industrial complexes or warehouses and so forth. We have huge investment opportunities that the government is working on in housing through the Bernard Lodge developments and schemes. And so on. I mean, so these are, sort of, and on the PPP front, there are in other areas likely to come on stream, PPP opportunities in water and in health. So through divestments, through PPP facilities, and divestments here of government operating assets, divestments of strategic, of land that can be used for commercial activities, and through PPPs, these will create tremendous investment opportunities for investors who are looking for those kinds of opportunities.
Thank you, Minister. So I want to make it real
So,
now
Dan,
for our investors.
Dan,
Minister,
my
the
question.
junior market threshold, $500 million. This has existed for over 12 years. When could we possibly expect that you would look to increase that threshold as a means of providing, again, more stimulus for folks to invest?
Yeah, that's something that was presented to us, by the Jamaica Stock Exchange some time ago, and that's something I'm giving very serious consideration to. So let's see.
Excellent.
So, Minister, let me do a plug for that. That is the only government program that costs you nothing, create more taxes, create more jobs, and create more transparent companies. And it changes the culture from minimizing profit, you know why, to maximizing profit. So it's very beneficial to everybody. And I think if you look on it in that light, you probably would approve it like 3 months ago. Yeah. It's a good thing.
Don't cost them anything.
That's what you call a big plug.
No, but it's a fact. The number support it. And where it is right now at 500, it's really no longer an incentive. The money, you guys did a great job and the economy explode. And, that is just like a small money now. People don't really, they don't motivate people again. So you need to
up it. No,
yeah.
As I said, it's something that we're looking at. It's not something that, I'm opposed to, but allow us to do the proper consultations and, we're certainly, as far as economic policy making is concerned, under this administration, we are quite deliberate and intentional in what we do and very thoughtful. No kind of knee-jerk kind of responses. Everything is done on a principled basis. So, as I said, I don't think I need to say anymore.
Enough said, Minister.
Enough said.
Like how you moved the little tax threshold from $500 to $1,000 to import. I'm sure he can move. Hey, right, boy. I'm sure he can move the threshold for the junior market from 500 million to.
No, I warn you, Dan. If you press him too hard, you're just going.
No, man. I'm
have a longer wait.
I've known the minister for 35 years.
Let's put it this way.
35 years.
It was on this forum.
Yes.
That a couple of years ago, they gave a commitment that we're looking on the customs duty threshold.
Yes.
So,
and it came to light.
Enough said.
I appreciate that. Gary Peart, I believe you're online, Mr. CEO. Do you happen to have a question for Minister Clarke?
I'll give it the easier one first. Is there a and if so, part two of that question, there are people who feel that the debt is coming up too fast, and some of those resources could be put into other productive areas to generate the growth. What's your comment on that? And then the final question: we're into the silly season. Your government is about to announce. And what is in place to ensure that if there is a run type scenario? I know you personally are responsible, but if somebody turns their hand, we get back into that.
So I heard the second question. I didn't hear the first or third.
We didn't hear the first or the third question.
Yeah, you're kind of close to the mic.
Go ahead and repeat your first and third question. Go ahead and repeat your first and third.
So first question: what do you think the identity ratio for Jamaica? I know that into wars, but ultimately there is a figure. There's some critics who say that we're paying down debt faster than we need to, and some of that excess could be redeployed in areas of the economy to generate more growth. How do you address that? And then the final question is, your government is about to announce the date for a local or general election. And what is in place to ensure that we can never get a runaway type scenario? Is it just up to you to determine that you're going to place them under X, Y, Z, or are there certain controls that can prevent it?
All right, thank you for those questions, Gary. On the first point, I spoke about this extensively in my budget presentation in March. While our debt target is 60%, it doesn't mean that, you know, let me address it from another point of view. When you look at countries of our size that are very successful, meaning countries that have the vulnerability of small size, you find debt ratios that are significantly below ours and quite a bit below 60%. Debt ratios of 40 and 20 and 30. And I gave a lot of examples in my, in fact, I might just recall it in a second and then come back and give you some of those statistics. But remember that what we're saying, Gary, is that when you have your interest costs introduces inflexibility into your fiscal affairs. If something happens, it's not that you can reduce the interest costs to respond to the crisis. And that is why lower debt for a small, open, vulnerable country is often better. I don't know that I could tell you what an ideal number is. What I can tell you, however, is that we're focused on Jamaica's laws as they stand today. And those laws, as they stand today, are to achieve a debt ratio of 60% by March of 2028. And that is what our policy is consistent with. With respect to pace of, this is that critique, as far as I'm concerned, is a critique against, success. We are successfully adhering to the laws of Jamaica. The fiscal balances that are targeted each year are not discretionary. Apart from the time when we escaped our fiscal rules in accordance with how you escape the fiscal rules as prescribed by law. Right? In that year, we are out of the fiscal rules, then you have a discretionary target. But once you're in our fiscal rules, the fiscal balance target is programmatically determined by the law. So this business of I am discretionarily reducing faster is inconsistent with the reality. It's just not true. Each year, we target a fiscal balance that is consistent with Jamaica's fiscal rules. And that seriousness of purpose, that commitment, sends a message to consumers, citizens, and investors that the government is serious about preserving an environment that's conducive to increase economic activity, increase investment, and increase jobs. Wishy-washy speech and speaking in an uncommittal way about important targets sends the wrong message to consumers, investors, and persons in, consumers, investors, and citizens. And that would be counterproductive to the objectives that we outlined earlier. So we, Gary, have simply been faithful to the fiscal rules that have been passed in Parliament and the fiscal responsibility architecture that we have improved over time. Your third question was, oh, right. That's a very a very good question, very relevant question. Again, Gary, we have fiscal rules, and these are not, our fiscal rules require that when a budget is tabled, the Auditor General has 2 weeks to review the budget and to provide a letter or certificate that the parameters of the budget are consistent with Jamaica's fiscal rules. That is the protection that you have. That if a budget is tabled where a fiscal balance is being programmed that is inconsistent with the fiscal rules, the law empowers the Auditor General to call it out. And we are in the process of building out an independent fiscal commission. A fiscal commissioner has already been appointed. And as soon as his office is functional, up and running, staffed, and ready to go, that responsibility will move from the Office of the Auditor General to the Office of the Fiscal Commissioner. So the protection that you have, whether by way of the Independent Fiscal Commissioner, if we get there in time, or the Auditor General, if an election is held before the Fiscal Commissioner office comes into being, budgets tabled are required to be consistent with fiscal rules, meaning the fiscal balance being targeted has to be consistent with the achievement of the 60% debt target by 2028.
And folks, I promise you we're going to wrap up in about 10 minutes. We'll have 2 more questions from the panel, and then we'll take 3 questions from the floor, and there'll be a mic available. So my last question, then Chairman, I'll provide you with a question, and then we move on. Minister, I want to talk a little bit about interest rates, because we know this relatively high interest rate regime is kind of the enemy of the capital markets, and stock performance, the performance on stock market is generally inversely related to this high interest rate regime. So central bank's been holding rates at about 7% for some time. It's good in general for the economy in terms of inflation targeting. Looks to me like inflation's coming under control. Could you just share some thoughts from your perspective about how you feel about interest rates going forward? I mean, this is a cost to you in the next budget year. Just general expectations in terms of interest rates, what you'd like to see happening. And I appreciate we have an independent central bank, so answer as best you can.
So, yes, we thank you for that question, Dan. We made the central bank independent, so I'm not about to seek to walk that back. It's their job to determine and then not the central. It's the job of the Monetary Policy Committee to determine a policy rate from time to time that's consistent with the achievement of the inflation target of 4 to 6%, and it's done in a transparent way. Minutes of those meetings are made public, and the central bank is required, or the governor is required, to appear before Parliament. Now, clearly we're not over the inflation hump just yet. We got within the target band, in September and October, I believe. But the transportation blip, which is quite a blip, quite a big hit in November, will be with us for some time. So, as the central bank has said, it may take some time for inflation to return to the target level. Jamaica, as a small country with whom our big neighbor to the north, the United States, the central, monetary conditions in Jamaica are not independent of the monetary conditions in the United States. So if, Jamaican policy rate's at 7% and the US policy rate at 5%, 2-point spread, from what I've heard the central bank say, it's important that a spread exists. One has always, it wasn't necessarily that wide, but so I would say to you, Dan, a number of factors are at play there. It depends on what happens in the United States, depends on what happens with the trajectory and the outturn of inflation here in Jamaica. But, I think you can be assured that we have a credible, well-capitalized institution that is mandated by law to pursue policy that can, over the long term or medium term, achieve the inflation target. And that is extremely important to investors over the long term. I would say that, what we don't want is what our history has been. And the history has been that inflation shocks lead to second order and third order and fourth order effects. And you just end up in a period of high inflation for a long period of time, which is where we were. We were in double-digit inflation minus a few quarters for the vast majority of, for a big 30-year period. And we don't want to return to that. So, I would say let's, allow the central bank to do its job. I think having conversation around it is important. That kind of dialogue is important. And, but the central bank is, has a mandate, and a mandate that's in the interest of Jamaica to ensure that we achieve low and stable inflation.
Is my mic on? So I wouldn't be like Dan and ask you to comment on things that is not in your portfolio. But what I would ask is this. No, hypothetically, let's assume that the US Fed stays where it is. They have forecast that they expect 3 or 4 cuts this year. But, we see the war, we see a lot of things we don't know what's going to happen. We really don't know. How long do you think our growth trajectory can hold up under this current interest rate, this 7? This is where we are now.
Yeah. So this is where it's never good for a policymaker to be dealing with hypothetical questions that can get you into all kind of problems. But I understand what you're asking. No, I understand what you're.
The growth numbers, quarter to quarter, they keep going in the wrong direction.
I understand what you're asking. So, inflation, there is a trade-off between the objective of.
Yeah, but we don't really control inflation.
Hold a second. There is a trade-off between the objective of returning inflation to low levels and certain levels of growth. There's no doubt that there's a trade-off. But for those, Mr. Chairman, who are on more modest means, inflation is a scourge. For those who have assets and lots of assets, they have the means to ride out inflation over a long period of time. So during the period of high.
No, I am not against the policy,
So the trade-off.
I agree with the policy.
Sure.
Because you have to guard. You don't want the runaway inflation.
No, we can't.
So I'm saying take the policy as a given, right? And based on what we're seeing now with the shipping in the Red Sea and all of that, it's the last numbers out of the US were not positive as far as inflation are concerned, but it was just a 1 month blip in the wrong direction.
It's quite possible that US rates may stay as they are until the second half. That's quite possible.
That's my point.
Or even the last.
So, assuming the rates stay where they are, can we keep getting the growth we are getting now? Are we gonna,
well,
how long can we keep this growth going?
Let's put it this way: the forecast from the multilaterals, the World Bank, and who was it that came out last week? And even the fund that came out in November, I mean, the forecast for Jamaica is 2020, is for Jamaica to grow in 2024. You are correct that it may not be as high a growth rate as 2023. You're correct in that, but those are the forecasts.
Well, I'm hoping it's going to be higher, but
not my
we don't
forecast.
control inflation, and so we don't control the Fed. We don't.
Yeah. So it's undoubtedly a tricky time, in sort of policy making, because you're, in economic policy, there's never a perfect set of circumstances. There are always trade-offs. There are always, there's always a requirement of balancing objectives. And we're going through a period of time where it's important that we don't reach, from a United States perspective, don't reach the edge of the inflation crisis in the 1970s, the late 1970s. And from a Jamaican perspective, we don't return to the high inflation period that has so long characterized our experience. But that definitely can come at an expense of some growth. So far, people have been expecting a soft landing, meaning that we'll be able to both tame inflation and keep growth. So far, that seems to be the consensus. And, that's likely to be the case in 2024. But, let's see. Yeah, let's see. As of now, the prospects for 2024 are that Jamaica will experience growth. Yeah.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Chairman Berry. So at this point in time, again, yes.
In our budget presentation this year, I was talking about that point that Gary had mentioned.
Yes.
About, and I said, I can't tell you what the right level of debt is, but let me share with you that countries like the Dominican Republic, and those are countries that definitely we look to as countries that are doing it very, very well. Their debt ratio is 44%. Ireland, you remember Ireland? And this is as at, I gave this speech in March of 2023, so I'm giving you numbers as at that time. Dominican Republic, 44%. You remember Ireland in the global financial crisis? Ireland ended up guaranteeing retail deposits and ended up in a debt crisis. You remember that? And they might have even gotten some bailouts from the European Union. Ireland's debt is at 42%. Latvia and Lithuania, their debt is at 36%. New Zealand, debt is at 23%. Estonia, their debt is at 9%. I mean, these are countries that recognize that because they're small, what do these guys have in common? They're all small. Because they're small and high functioning, their resilience is important to them, and a big part of the resilience is not having high levels of debt. As I said, that's not my focus. My focus is Jamaica's fiscal rules, where the target is 60%. But it's important for our society to be aware of these kind of information, for perspective.
Thanks for that, Minister. Okay, so at this point in time, 3 more questions, and I want to wrap it up. So there'll be a mic available, and we will take the first 3 questions that I can recognize, and we'll take it from there. So who's got the roving mic? I'll take the first one to Mr. Ryan Reed over here, this handsome gentleman there with the nice hairstyle.
Good evening, Minister. Question. The government has presided over a material public sector wage increase, right? And we recognize that consumption is the largest component of GDP. To what extent do you anticipate an impact positively on the economy with this sizable public sector wage increase?
Thank you for that question. Thanks for that question, Ryan. It's a very, thank you for giving me the opportunity to respond to that. Yes, consumption and investment are key components of GDP. What the economic literature definitely, there's a kind of consensus on is that, for open economies, and by open economy, trade is a large part of GDP. So you import what you use, right? So small open economies, consumption is not a reliable driver of growth because a lot of what we consume comes from outside. So boosting consumption, in Jamaica, boosts the production of our external partners. You look around the table, every stuff in here, right? A lot of what we consume is imported or has a lot, even if it's made here, has a large import content. So boosting consumption is not a reliable, I'm not saying that boosting consumption is wrong. I'm just saying that it's not a reliable way of generating growth. For smaller open economies like ours, the more reliable way of catalyzing growth is through investment. That too has external components. There's lots of leakage in investment because there's a lot of import content investment, but you're likely to have more retention. So I would not expect the increase in ability to consume on behalf of 100,000 public sector employees to have a noticeable impact on growth.
Next question we'll take here, and I'll do a follow-up, Minister, but of course it's still important in your fiscal rules, I would imagine, to maintain the labor bill as a certain percentage of GDP, and perhaps productivity and growing the GDP would be other concerns to counter that labor sector reform that you just went through?
Just to speak about that for a little bit. Remember, hello? Okay.
Yes.
You're live.
Right, sorry. Remember, we had that as a part of our rule, the wage rule. We removed that for a number of reasons. One is that the wage rule was done at a time when legally certain aspects of wages and salaries were captured in programs. So while wages and salaries were 9%, or we got to 9.2% before the pandemic, we had significant allowances that were under programs. And some of those were tax-free allowances. And those allowances amounted to about 1% before you consider the taxable equivalent, 1% of GDP. So on a taxable basis, those allowances were about 1.5% of GDP. So the appropriate comparison is the 9.2 plus 1.5, 10.7. That is what a more accurate description of what our cost of public sector employees was prior to the reform. Now, post the reform, that number has gone up, and I've spoken about that before, and it's gone up by a couple of points. For me, that is justified on the basis of the fact that we had achieved much of our fiscal rehabilitation on the back of unsustainable wage compression. You could do it for so long, but you can't maintain a country by paying people at those levels. So an adjustment had to come. In order to make sure we have the skills and we can replace the gaps. But, we have to make sure that this reform is one-off and that in subsequent rounds we're doing cost of living adjustments, or else we will run into problematic circumstances. So in taking it out of the environment, we took it out of because you can't target. It's like saying, what's a good private sector analogy? It's.
Well, my main point is that labor productivity must still be a strong focus of the government, despite
absolutely. It has to be. It has to be. And there's a piece of the reform that is remaining, and that is the reform of the performance element of compensation. There's a performance management system in place, but it's broken in the sense that it does not appropriately differentiate on performance. So monies are paid, but we don't believe that it's achieving its purpose. The idea is to revamp it and to create a performance management system in its place that is aligned with national objectives being achieved. And that when it is paid, it really means that, there's a performance that's deserving of it. And that segment of the reform is to come.
Thank you. Next question.
Yes, Minister. Going back to the productivity of labor. A lot of us feel that the labor laws in Jamaica is affecting the productivity of labor. Is the government looking at these labor laws to make a change? Because we really feel that that is what is causing a lot of the low productivity of labor, the laws that exist.
Yes, I know. That's not my portfolio.
I protect you. I protect
yeah,
you.
I don't
Don't
have
answer
portfolio.
that. I forbid you
It affects
to allow
production.
Mr. Ian Levy to get you in trouble.
It affects production.
No, we strike out that question, Ian. That's a disallowed question.
Not my portfolio.
We can't bring the minister here and get
One
him in
final
trouble.
question, guys, and we'll wrap this up. Going once up, that looks like Mario. What? At the back? And that'll be the final question. I'm sorry. One more from Mario Watt at the back over there. And that'll be it. I do want to wrap this up because we have folks online now. We've been going for 90 minutes, which is exceedingly long. So final question.
Hello, good night, Mr. Minister, members of the
Night,
panel,
Mario.
invited guests. Quick question. You mentioned changing the composition of the debt over the next couple of years, I think out to 2028. Currently, U.S. debt roughly, as you mentioned, about 60% compared to 40% on the local side. We have quite a bit of debt that matures over the next 3 to 4 years. Do you think the opportunity exists whereby we could float another local currency instrument similar to what was done in November? I think it raised around 300 million. And that's the first part. If not, do you think the opportunity exists whereby we could float maybe a floating rate bond versus a fixed rate, maybe over a shorter tenor, to take advantage of the potential reduction in interest rates going forward?
No, say that part again. Could we? I heard a J dollar, but what about
Right.
floating rate?
So if we're not able to float, say, local currency debt with the 3 maturities, I think, coming over the next couple of years, do you think the opportunity exists whereby we could do a floating rate bond versus the traditional fixed rate bond,
Okay.
given the level of interest rates and the potential that rates could come down over the next couple of years?
Right. So yes, you're correct. We have a couple of maturities coming up. Some of them certainly, for this year, you remember we pre-financed our maturities for 23 and for 24 with the Resilience and Sustainability Facility, $924 million at concessional interest rates. So that's why, even though interest costs have gone up, we haven't felt the full brunt of interest cost movements because, we saw an opportunity and we grabbed it early in the day and qualified for the fund's RSF. Those rates, yes, sub 4%, or around that level, as compared with borrowing in US dollars internationally, would have been about 7.5%, 8% or thereabouts. The opportunity definitely exists to tap into the local market for some of the other maturities that have not yet been pre-financed, and I'm sure the debt management unit will be looking at that. In terms of the sort of characteristics of those offerings, it would be premature of me to sort of speculate on that. The debt management unit does their market soundings, and clearly there are advantages of each has its sort of own advantage, and we'll look at that when the time comes. But you can know in advance that the policy position is to move towards lowering the composition. It's not, as I said, it's not something we're going to get massive changes in a short time. Against the background of declining debt, it's going to take some time to get movement on it. And it's not, we have a relationship with the World Bank. We have a relationship with IDB. It's not that we can stop borrowing from those entities. And to the extent that we have some of those debts maturing, it's not that you want to like dwindle your reserves to pay them back so you can borrow in Jamaica. So there's a lot of stuff that has to be kept in balance, right? And therefore, the change is one that will come moderately over time. But I'm saying it on a platform that is the policy objective. And one that, but sorry, to your point, what we will definitely aim to do is to issue more local currency instruments internationally, as we did in November.
A question, Mario, well done. Chairman, I'd like to turn over to you for the closing remarks so we could bring this segment of the program to a close.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Minister, for, keeping this tradition going. Mayberry will be 39 this year, and certainly our investor forum is coming up to 30, if not more than 30 years. And of course, wouldn't be possible without all of you folks who made it possible. So we appreciate that. And, earlier the minister was talking about the whole issue of getting the fiscal right. And he said that for 50 years we got it wrong. And we're in our 60 little bit year. And, it's one of the few things that we have gotten right in Jamaica. And as he said, we have to guard it. I think in 2014, I saw the trend.
Chris, Chairman, we have to guard all pillars, the financial sector stability. Everybody has to be.
No, I'm wrapping all of that in one.
No, but not just the fiscal.
No, when I say fiscal, I mean
you mean the whole, all of
whole fiscal responsibility program, including all those factors. I'm putting that in one. It's not just the budget.
I can't lose this opportunity.
Yeah.
Because all the support that we can have as a country for maintaining those 4 pillars. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. So, in 2014, Mayberry saw the work of the previous government, and in 2014, we moved a lot of our assets back to Jamaica, invested in the JSE. We had a feeling that it would have been something that would have been maintained. It has worked out for us. And as the minister said, this is something that we have to really, any future government that come and want to change this, we must not allow it, because this is a foundation for future prosperity for the Jamaican people. So thanks for coming again. And I know the guys out there in the audience will see you at other forums, but Minister, we might not see you again until next year. And thanks for making it happen once again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
The Mayberry Investments Limited Virtual Investor Forum has been the standard for investor education in Jamaica for decades, where top financial minds provide comprehensive insight into the market and ideal investment strategies and opportunities for our clients. Celebrating 37 years of excellence in investment banking. The Mayberry Virtual Investor Forum, investing in Jamaica.